And this is what I tell people all the time. It's like time is the most precious resource. And so you have to be sure that you're devoting it to the things that are going to contribute to where you want to go. And just to go back to what you were saying, Jacob, like those high mileage weeks, you have to look at that and think, do I have the physical conditioning prerequisites to do that?
Running 100 miles seems impossible, and maybe even kind of crazy. And it is, but we believe in big crazy dreams. That's why we ran 100 miles. It was such a life-changing experience for us, we decided to devote this podcast to preparing and inspiring you to run your first ultra race.
Are you ready to feel the highest highs and the lowest lows? Are you ready to do what you once thought was impossible? Are you ready for your trail to 100? Thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. We are excited to hear your story as well as the knowledge that you've gained through the years.
Thanks, guys. I'm super excited to be here and to dive into all things ultra running and just like geek out on all the fun stuff.
This is the life, right?
Yeah.
So, Megan, where did ultra running start for you?
It didn't start until I was well into my 30s. I ran my first marathon on my actual 30th birthday. I was in Phoenix. My birthday's in January, so I was living in Boston at the time, and I was searching races, and I was like, wouldn't it be cool if I ran my first marathon? And so I was Googling races, came up with it was like a rock and roll series marathon in Vegas. And so I flew to Vegas. I was in Boston, but then ended up in Vegas. And it was sorry, not Vegas, Phoenix. I don't know why I'm messing that up. In Phoenix on my birthday, and it was hot, so you go from East Coast to West Coast heat, and I was not prepared for that. But so after that, I sort of got the bug, I was like, okay, well, that was hard, but I didn't die, so what's next? And I got to a place where I wasn't really loving running on the roads. And then I think I saw an article in Runner's World that was talking about trail running and ultras. And I was like, wait a second, you can go further than a marathon and I don't have to pound the pavement. What is this all about? And so that's sort of the short version of how I got introduced to ultras. And it wasn't until 6 or so years after that I ran my first ultra, my first 50K. So it took me a little bit of time to transition from one to the other.
Wow. We actually just heard about those rock and roll races this past weekend where
we were at the Ogden Marathon convention, and they were there and showing off their giant medals that are as big as your face and their pictures of the races, and everybody is shoulder to shoulder. There's thousands of people.
Yes.
This is honestly, we were like, yeah, that's not our kind of race.
Yeah. It's, honestly, it was my kind of race back then because every mile is something, whether it's a performer, like a dancer, or an artist performing, or a musical act. So it really broke up the long race into something that was in ultras, we run from aid station to aid station. In those type of races, we run from performer to performer. So it really helped to break it up. And then there were aid stations, a couple of them, just water stations along the way. So, and, it was in Phoenix. And so there were some things to look at, but it wasn't, it wasn't I actually did do the one in Vegas as well, which is why I was sort of confusing the two of them. The one in Vegas was great because, so many different performers, like showgirls and all sorts of crazy stuff. So if that's your cup of tea, it's a cool place and a cool thing to do. But yeah, after I did two of those, and then that was sort of in their early phases. And then they've just gotten so, like you said, so big that it's just that's too many people. It's so many people.
I can see the appeal. It's a really cool, unique idea for sure.
Yeah. So from what I understand, Megan, you dealt with some health issues before you started running these marathons and ultimately got into ultras. Could you take us through what you dealt with and had to overcome?
Yeah. It started back when I was playing softball in college, and I would just start to get this like really uncomfortable sort of shooting pain going up the backside of my right leg into my hip. And sometimes it was so debilitating that I couldn't really move. Like I couldn't put pressure on it. And it would come and go. And so over the course of my softball career, quote unquote, in college, it never really was. I mean, like, I went to the training room to get, stuff done to my shoulder because I was playing a lot and throwing, and I played every game, so it never really got a rest. And I would say like, "Hey, I have this thing going on where I'm getting this, like, pain, literal pain in my butt." And they were like, "Well, we don't really know what to do with that." And so I just sort of grinned and bared it. And then it went away when I graduated college. And then it came back with a vengeance when I really started to do more working out and when I took up just running for exercise because I'd always played team sports growing up and all the way through college. And then after I graduated and I didn't have that outlet anymore, I had to, find other ways to be physical. So I would go to the gym and I would run. And when I started running, that's when it came back. And so it basically culminated in me coming back from a run when I lived in Connecticut on a holiday weekend, laying on the floor to do some stretching, and then I couldn't get up because my whole back and lower body seized up. And I was like,
Oh
"Oh,
my
this is
gosh.
not good." So I ended up having my phone nearby and started texting all of my friends and coworkers. I was like, "Someone needs to come." I literally couldn't get off the floor. And I was 26 years old at the time, so, like, way too young to have back problems, the type of back problems that you hear your parents and your grandparents talking about, and nobody was
Was
there
this
to come and help me.
Were you paralyzed, or was it
I
just, like, you
wasn't.
were in so much pain that you couldn't
Yes.
move?
Yeah.
Okay,
Basically, my
okay.
back seized up, and I was just any way I rolled, I would just get this shooting pain, and I was like, "This," and
Mm.
there was a point where I was like, "Is this more serious than me just sort of throwing my back out?" And so none of my friends were there, but one of my good friends texted her chiropractor, a guy I had never met, and he came over to my house. Mind you, I'm in my sports bra and my running shorts
You're
laying
like,
on
"Hey,
my
it's nice to
living room
meet you."
floor. Quite literally, he opened the door and I was like, "Please don't be a serial killer. Like, there's nothing I can do." And luckily, obviously, he was not. I lived to tell the tale. He sort of like rolled me over and helped me up, and he gave me a little bit of an adjustment. And I was just like, okay, this cannot happen again. So that's what sort of set me on the trajectory to try and figure it out. And I went to a bunch of orthopedic doctors, and they really wanted to give me non-inflammatory anti-steroidal drugs, NSAIDs, and do like all this crazy muscle testing. And I was just like, I feel like we're skipping a step. I feel like there might be something that I could do here in between that stuff. And so eventually I just started to piece it together myself. But yeah, it was basically came down to it being sciatic nerve pain, something that they don't really necessarily know what to do with because it's not really an injury. I didn't break anything. I didn't, you can't, how do you classify that in the medical, terms? So that was sort of where they were trying to push me to get to a place where they, could classify it as something and put me down a path. And I was just like, I think I need to like take a beat and try and figure this out for myself.
So you've taken a beat and saying, "I'm gonna figure this out for myself." I I wanted to hit on that because I've talked to a lot of people, especially, friends and family who don't run. And
Yeah.
especially when they hear about you, running and running ultras, especially every runner gets it. They get the like, "Oh yeah, I tried running once and then this happened, and I got
Got
hurt."
injured, and you're gonna need a
Yeah.
knee replacement by the time you're 40.
you know and everyone brings up their injury of like, something happened when I started getting the running and I started to hurt.
Mhm.
And so did you have the idea or did you question like maybe running's not for me, running brought on this sciatica pain, and what made you decide like, no, I'm gonna rather than just kick running to the curb, I'm gonna figure out what's going on?
Well, I think if I hadn't experienced it in college, then I would have directly correlated the pain with the running. And
Okay.
and so when it started to flare back up again, when I kicked up my running, then I obviously knew that it was something that I was doing that was causing this to happen. But I don't think there was ever a time where I was like, I'm just not going to run because of this thing, because I really just had this idea in my head as I kept, it started when I was in college and then it really flared up again when I was in my like mid 20s. And in my head, I was just like, I'm too young for this to now be the trajectory and like how I live the rest of my life. I just refused to accept that this was going to be my lot in life to have quote unquote back issues and, not be able to do the things that I wanted to do. So I just don't, I, I don't have it in me to quit, which is like a
Sound like an
really
ultra
great
runner.
skill. Yeah. It's like unbeknownst to me, early on, like that's a really great skill to have in ultra running to a certain degree, right? But I just wasn't willing to accept this as my new fate.
This story makes me so excited because I'm a physical therapist assistant. I don't work as a PTA anymore
Hmm.
for lots of reasons. The healthcare system, that's a whole nother rant. But anyways, I saw so many people. I did home health for a long time, and I saw so many
Mm.
people just succumb to their injuries and the pain, and they didn't do anything to try. They just accepted that this is my fate. I'm just a
Yep.
broken human. And it just broke my heart. And a lot
Hmm.
of the people that I worked with, they'd made up their mind. No matter what you said, they just decided, I am a broken person. This is how I live. And I
Yep.
just remember thinking all the time, if you could just change your mindset, I have some tools for you here. I have some other people I can refer you to. There's so many options. You don't have to live this way. So
Yes.
that just excites me that you immediately were like, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to figure this out.
Yeah, and I had actually gone like I had the benefit of having all four of my grandparents alive throughout my youth and growing up, and I watched them sort of progress through the years. And one of my grandfathers did really well, was like super active, made it all the way to 95, and the only reason he passed away was because of sort of a freak accident, and he walked
Wow.
every day. He was very active. And then I had the benefit of watching the complete opposite of that with one of my grandmothers, and she just was always sort of constantly plagued with health issues, and her mindset, to your point, just wasn't good. And so I had that perspective as well. It's like I want to end up like my grandfather, charging hard into my 90s versus, the opposite, which is just to succumb to this. And so and I see a lot of people that are sort of in that same boat, that just in general, like, just out and around, people that I know, friends and family and stuff like that, who have just accepted that this is their lot in life. And it's sad sometimes to see that to that same extent, because you're like, there are tons of possibilities, and it really starts with your mindset. Because if you have that spark, then all sorts of doors start to open up and you can figure out ways to solve for whatever the problem is. But if you're not willing to at least like entertain the idea, then it's just going to be, doors are closing all around you.
For sure. And kind of building off of what you're talking about with your grandparents and
Mm.
your grandpa who he got out and he walked every day. I think
Hmm.
that's the key is to just never stop moving. You just need
Yes.
to keep moving. Even if it's
Yes.
just getting out and walking a little bit every day, you just need to keep moving.
I totally agree. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's one of my main tenets for myself, but also with all of my clients too. It's just like we have to inject more movement of all of the body from head to toe, because that's sort of the recipe, right, for a healthy body.
Amen. Motion is lotion, right?
Totally.
And we're talking about it's funny though, because we're talking about just being, overall a healthy lifestyle right now, but like everything you guys are saying, I'm just thinking like that directly applies to ultra running, every
Yeah.
single one of these
Oh yeah,
things. So
just keep moving. When it
yeah.
when it gets
Mhm.
hard and it starts to hurt,
Yeah,
just keep moving.
refusing to accept the, defeat. So we wanna
Yeah.
dive into that right now, actually. So the doctors wanna give you drugs. You're thinking, "This doesn't sound quite right." How did you start to figure it out then?
So, I mean, I'd always been physically active and just sort of interested in sports and I say strength training, but back then, I'm going to really date myself here, but like, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't much by way of strength training for women. It was basically, I
Mm.
tell the story sometimes about being in college and getting our workouts out of Cosmo and like Men's Muscle and Fitness magazine and like, trying to merge the two
Oh
things.
my
And
gosh.
I mean, yeah, it was sort of like the wild, wild west back then. But and so I'd always just sort of been interested in, being strong and playing sports and that kind of thing. So I knew that there was likely a physical solution to this, but I didn't know what it was. So someone suggested yoga to me. So I started going to this yoga class, a local instructor, and it wasn't the solution. It was too hard and fast. It was like a vinyasa flow class, and I dug myself a little bit of a hole there because the instructor could see that I had a lot of mobility and a lot of capability, and so he pushed me to do some stuff that was, like, not good, like, just beyond my capacity to own and control, like, just I was flexible enough, but I didn't own and control that range of motion. And so I sort of took 2 steps back in order to take a step forwards. And so it was just sort of this progression of, okay, well, yoga, that type of yoga wasn't it, but maybe this kind of something was it. And so I went from yoga and then I got more invested in strength training and got certified as a personal trainer. And that sort of helped because then I started to do some of the foundational exercises that I skipped over in the Cosmo muscle and fitness days because I was just doing what the magazines told me. And I started to really go back to square one and be like, okay, what makes up a strong shoulder? What makes up a strong hip? And I started to work those aspects of it. And then the next thing was, okay, I really like yoga. So I'm going to practice it, but it's going to be more in like a gentler style, right? That just more focuses on stretching versus power flow. And then I was like, okay, well, that's great. My overarching theme here is that like I get interested in something and then I get certified in it. And I like that's the ladder rung that I just start climbing up. And so
I love it.
yeah, I've just stacked up a bunch of stuff over the years because I've gotten interested in it. It's benefited me. And then I've sort of created a system for myself on how I implement it with my own training. And it's just really worked well. So, yoga, strength training. Then I got really into functional range conditioning, which is sort of focuses on the joints and their capacities and learning how to, like I said before, make a really killer shoulder, make a really killer hip or knee or foot. And that's really where I poured gasoline on the fire, so to speak, and really got to a place where I've been able to run for the last 10 plus years without any sciatic pain. So lots of little stuff that adds up to one big picture.
Wow. So first of all, I just want to say you hit on something so important is I feel like where people need to be educated is in stability and proper form.
Mm,
Everybody skips over that. You go get a personal trainer, you look up the workouts on Google and you're like, I'm gonna get fit. And so you start lifting weights and you start running, and people just forget that you need to strengthen your core and your joints and improve your movement patterns before you jump into the heavy stuff before you're ready. That's
mhm.
how injuries happen. So you dove into this world, you got all these certifications. Did you get rid of this sciatica pain, these issues you were having?
I did, yeah. It took a while. It wasn't like, oh, I started strength training and went away. It was always 2 steps forwards, 1 step backwards type of a thing because I would get really into lifting, but then I would overdo it, in
Mhm.
some way, shape, or form, and then the sciatica would come back, and I'd be like, "Okay, note to self, like, this is not the solution." And then I'd get interested in, another facet or a different form of movement. There's if you're sort of in the strength training movement world, there's all sorts of rabbit holes that you can go down into. And so I went down a bunch of them. Some of them were beneficial, some of them were like, that's not for me. And so it was just this process over time of testing. I always refer to myself as like the human crash test dummy because I'm the one that's like doing all of the stuff and reporting back and like sharing it with now I share it with, the people that listen to my podcast and the people that I help and coach. But back then it was just like, okay, I did this, I'm making notes, note to self, what worked, what didn't. But it probably took, well, from the time I was 26 until right after my first ultra. So it probably took me a process of about 10 years to figure this out, which sounds like so long, but it wasn't as if I was in constant pain 24/7 over those, 10 years. It would come and go. Certain times it would be way high and then it would be like I wouldn't see it for 6 months. And so it was very
Mm.
frustrating in that sense because I wouldn't know if it was just gonna pop up out of nowhere. I could kind of predict based on the volume and the type of work that I was doing, but every once in a while, there'd be something that it would just trigger it, and I'd be like, "Oof, that is unexpected."
That's frustrating. I think every runner has one thing that on and off relationship with this injury that just keeps coming back and then going away. And it's like, oh, did I figure it out? Did I solve the problem? Oh, and then all of a sudden it pops up again.
So, Megan, it sounds like, as you said, you've been down the rabbit hole, many of them with strength and mobility, and you've got
Yep.
certifications and you've had a lot of learning go into that. So, what role, strength and mobility is, especially for a beginner ultra runner, is
Mhm.
a really tricky one to figure out. As Melody was just talking about, everyone's got that one thing that just is
Yep.
always coming, it'll go away, come back, go away, come back. So, what would you say, I guess, to that runner who's trying to ramp up, get to that 100-mile distance, but they have that one nagging thing that they never seem to be able to shake?
Mm. That's such a good question. I think my answer to that would be to sort of go back to the basics. I think it's easier to figure out the answer if you wipe the slate clean and think about yourself as a newbie coming into this. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is you need to have the body for what you're trying to do. I'm not trying to be an Olympic swimmer. I'm not trying to be a power lifter. I'm not trying to be an MMA fighter. I'm trying to be an ultra runner. And so, in order to do that, I need to have really killer hips. I need to have feet and ankles that are tough and resilient. I need to have knees that are up to the challenge. I need to have core strength. There's sort of like a punch list, so to speak, of the things that you really should focus on. And if you are somebody who has this recurring thing happening, I think that that's a good place for you to start to look at. Let's just say it's your knees. Are my knees really up to the challenge? And if they keep coming back and like raising their hand and trying to flag
Yeah.
you down and say like this is a problem, then that's a place that you need to have a look at and really focus on, okay, are my knees really up to the challenge? And sometimes with knees it's not necessarily the knee that is the problem because you've got that joint above and the joint below that can be contributing to that, but really just sort of stripping away all of the layers and just having an honest look at your body for its capacity for work and be like, okay, do I have a really killer hip or does it have some room to improve? And one of the ways that I try and prompt people to do this is going back to what we were talking about earlier, Melody, was like having some sort of daily movement, and whether that's walking. I'm a huge fan of this little thing that I created, and it's not like I didn't come up with this idea. Like everybody, it's just sort of a phrase that I coined, which is the daily shakedown, which is a movement practice that you sort of do from head to toe that serves as your self-assessment for and check in for your body. How are my shoulders doing? How's my spine doing? All this stuff. And when you implement this daily, you get to this place where you have a better understanding of how you're doing and what your capacity for work is that day and what's going on in the specific problem spots that might need some more attention. So that's the long-winded answer to your short question. That's how I would approach it.
That's a great answer. I love the daily shakedown, and it makes me think of Sally McRae, who is huge
Mm,
on I don't know what she calls it, but she's always doing self-assessments, and I feel like Sally McRae is the buffest female ultra runner. She is awesome. So I think that just kind of confirms the shakedown and the self-assessments. I have one question
yeah.
going back to, if you're feeling this issue or this thing coming up, what advice would you give somebody who maybe is having a hard time swallowing their pride and being honest with themselves? Maybe they're having a hard time admitting, oh, my knees really are not ready for a multi-directional lunge or something that
Or 100-mile race.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's a tricky one, and I can really empathize and sympathize with that person, and I have worked with a lot of people that have that frame of mind. The simple way to say
It's
this.
me. I'm the prideful person and I want to know. What would you tell me?
Well, I think that like the basic thing is, right? Like we all know where we're at. I think if we were just more honest with ourselves, I think a lot of times ultra running can be, we don't want to look silly, or we don't want to DNF, or we don't want to seem like we're not up to the task, but really these things that keep popping up. And again, like I was in this place, like I was pushing through a bunch of these races and trying to keep up a front for people that like, oh, I'm doing so great. Like my marathons are awesome. Like nothing's wrong. Meanwhile, I'm dragging my right leg across the finish line because I just can't, I'm like hiding the fact that I think I'm like bending over. People are thinking that like, oh, she's catching her breath. Like, no, I literally can't move because I have this shooting pain going up the backside of my leg. Like I knew it wasn't right. I knew something needed to be done about it. And I think if we just, talk about it more and sort of normalize this idea that like, look, your body is capable of doing amazing things if you just give it the nutrients, so to speak, that it needs. And whether that's food or water or rest or movement and mobility, it's going to pay you back tenfold. But you just have to be really honest with yourself because again, going back to like, I know when something's not right. And if I push through, it's likely that I'm going to end up, two steps back instead of one step forward like I want to be. I don't know that that's necessarily a good answer, but that's sort of like having a little come to Jesus with yourself, I think, is like really
Yeah.
important from time to time. And it can be challenging and it can really ding your ego. But I think if you're able to do that, you'll come out the other side a stronger, more resilient runner. I don't have anybody that I know of that has taken a step back to work on their mobility that didn't sort of accelerate their results
Mm.
from taking that step back, doing that assessment, and then putting in the work to be able to, boost their results.
So what I'm getting out of this is look at the long game. Like
Yes.
maybe you can push through this pain and finish this race and get a medal now and everyone's gonna clap for you and then burn out and
Yes.
do terrible for 5 years because you have this terrible injury versus you can maybe slow down, maybe you actually pull out of this race, take care of yourself, and then excel in the long term.
Yes. You said that much more eloquently than I did.
So here's a question coming to you from someone who is terrible at mobility. Is
We won't name
stretching
names.
Yes. Oh, I have lots of things that I am working on improving in my ultra
Oh,
running
don't we all?
world. So is stretching considered mobility?
Good question. I think in certain contexts it can be. I think for someone who doesn't do anything, I would file stretching under mobility, right? Because if you're doing nothing, again, something is always better than nothing. So if you take the 5 minutes after your run to do, a couple random stretches that just feel good to you, that's you planting the seed and giving yourself some positive feedback. Like if it feels good, you're going to keep doing it, right? I always talk about putting pennies in the bank. Every time you stretch, every time you do your shakedown, you're depositing a penny into your ultra running bank that over time, if you keep doing this on race day, you hand over that piggy bank and you cash in all of your pennies for your race day effort. And if you've put enough pennies in that bank, then you're going to get the result that you want. But going back to what we talked about earlier, Melody, like if you haven't put those pennies in, if you haven't done the work, if you've slacked off, then you're not going to be able to cash in your piggy bank, right? And you're going to end up hurt, or you're going to push beyond what you're capable of. So yeah, stretching is definitely can definitely be filed under mobility. And I think there's different levels of mobility work too. It starts out with stretching, and then we get into, like joint circles, which isn't just like, swinging your arm around. It's a more focused technique. And then we get into different types of techniques that are very similar to what you might do in PT, right? We talked about you being a PT assistant. Like the type of mobility work that I coach on is very similar to PT. And it actually is a really great way to, like, say you've injured your knee, since we're on this knee kick, and you've graduated from PT, the stuff that I help people with is a great way to sort of bridge from PT to going back to the thing you want to do. And this is my not so shameless plug for doing mobility work, because a lot of people think that once you've been, again, graduated from PT, that means you can go right back to where you were when you left off. And there's really this gap, right, that needs to be bridged. And this is where that focused mobility work can come in, because what you're trying to do in PT is sort of rehab and get back the functionality that you might have lost. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're ready to go right back to your training plan and training for a 100 miler or whatever distance. You have to create the strongest, most resilient, most bulletproof, so to speak, joint that you can. Because if you're going to run 100 miles on that thing, you need it to be bulletproof. You need it to be impermeable.
Oh my gosh, we need you everywhere. This is so awesome. That's one thing I noticed as a PTA. I was like, "There's this gap. There's this gap
Yeah.
between PT and then we released this teenager who had an ACL tear, and okay, you're fine to go back to your sport." And I never felt good about that. I was like, "They are not ready to do
Yeah.
that." Like, yeah, they
Yeah.
can walk and they can go to the bathroom on their own, but they're not ready to go play rugby. Like
No.
that's crazy.
And the problem is, it's just a simple fact. When you graduate from PT, people stop doing their exercises. Like we
Yeah.
know that, right? Like if you're not being held accountable to it, if someone's not going to check your work every week or every 2 weeks, like it's just not going to happen. And that's really the main friction point that I see with runners and doing mobility work, right? And so a lot of my, I'm going to use the word battle, but I like this sort of battle, this challenge. Like a lot of my battle is to get people to understand that there's more to ultra training, and definitely more to 100 miler training than just logging the miles. There's
Yeah.
all
Oh
these
yeah.
other components, sort of like what we talked about with your pillars, right? There's the strength training, there's the rest and the sleep, there's the nutrition, there's the mindset work. And then there's this mobility thing that people are like, that's just like, that's if I have time, or that's just like a nice thing to do. It's like, no, man, we got to do it, and we got to do it every day, and we got to be diligent about it. And if it's the only thing you do, Like, if you have to skip a run in order to do that, you're probably not gonna hear a lot of coaches say this, but, like, I will say it. If you have to skip your run because your shakedown says that your knee is super cranky, then you gotta skip that run and you gotta do the mobility stuff because that's what's going to deposit more pennies into the bank for a race day performance.
Oh, I agree 100%.
Dang. Like,
I love that. I'm
you
like, I wanna get on top of a roof and, like,
yeah.
shout hallelujah
We
in
were
the world.
I mean, like, we were talking about this the other day as, this has been a learning process, especially for me.
Mm.
But, like, you hear the typical, like, go out and get 70, 80 miles a week, to run 100 miles. And it's just never been our thing. And
Well,
we were
'cau we
talking,
haven't been ultra running for a long
yes.
time, like, our bodies just haven't been ready to hit
And
that
and a
mileage.
lot of times, time is an issue. Like 70,
Mhm.
80-mile weeks is a lot of time, especially if you're doing it on the trails with vert. And so we were talking about, you know what? If two men lined up to run 100 miles, same race, and one of them was running 70, 80-mile weeks, and the other one just maybe got up to 50, but did their strength and mobility, I'm putting my money on the one that did 50 with strength and mobility than the one who just got out there and logged the miles.
Me too, 100%. And this is what I tell people all the time. It's like time is the most precious resource. And so you have to be sure that you're devoting it to the things that are going to contribute to where you want to go. And just to go back to what you were saying, Jacob, like those high mileage weeks, you have to look at that and think, do I have the prerequisite, the physical conditioning prerequisites to do that? Right. Like I know so many, and that was the thing for me. So going way back in the story, I actually hired a professional coach to help me for my first marathon. And the first thing he did was have me running 6 days a week. And there was no
Ooh,
strength training, there was no mobility, there was nothing. He just gave me this plan and it involved 6 days a week of running. And I lasted maybe a month on that plan. And I just had to very respectfully part ways with him because I was just like, this is aggravating my sciatica. I can't do this. And that was when I sort of started to just take the wheel on my own training and figure out the recipe for all the things that I was putting into my training plan to make me a better runner. And I failed a lot. I tried a lot of stuff like I talked about before that didn't work. And this is where like I talk about a lot like there isn't one right way to train for any distance race. Like if you talk to, 10 different 100 mile finishers, they're all going to tell you they did different things. There's some basic underlying tenets, but everyone's going to have their own special recipe. And so if time is your most limiting factor, you got to look at, okay, what's the best use of my time? Like, is running 80 miles a week the best use of my time? Maybe, but like, could I take even 5 of those hours and devote them, a little bit here or there throughout the week to some sort of mobility, joint resilience training? And would that benefit me? Hell yeah, it would. It would definitely benefit. Like at some point, you're just getting they're just junk miles, right? At some point, you'll hit that threshold and it's just like, okay, here we go, another 10 miles. But like that time could be used for this and it would accelerate your overall results.
that is awesome.
Yeah, I think that is that is gold advice for running a successful training plan. Because, like you said, you were running 6 days a week, and
Yeah.
boom, injuries started coming back up.
You know what?
Yeah,
And
because my body just wasn't equipped to handle that, right? Like you
Yeah,
don't go from, being a recreational runner to me back then training for a marathon and then flipping this it's like lights on, lights off, right? Like I didn't go from lights off to lights on and go 6 days a week and have what it took to do that. And so that's the same idea. Just like be honest with yourself, have a look at what you have been doing and figure out, okay, is this plan that I'm going to follow? Like, did I make the logical progression to where this thing picks up? Or is there a gap in there that I need to spend some time working on to get me from where I am to where I want to go?
I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on the runners who they do just run and they don't break. Like, they can go run 120 miles a week, and they don't do mobility, they don't strength train, and they seem to be just fine.
Yeah. I've not met any of them personally.
We know
So,
one.
okay. Okay.
I know a handful
Oh,
of
you
people
know a
who just
handful. Okay.
they just
I'm
run
curious
and they
how
don't break.
old they are.
The
Um,
one I know is in his 30s.
yeah, I know one who is in his late 20s, early 30s.
Mm,
They're all pretty young now that I think
mm,
about it. I'd say, like, late 20s, early 30s are the ones I'm thinking
yeah.
of.
I mean, I always think you're always gonna have outliers, right? You're always gonna get those people that they do nothing but run, they seem bulletproof, they can't get injured, they can't do anything wrong, they do the max amount of everything, and they do fine. Then you're gonna always have the other end of the spectrum. You've got that one friend who does less than the bare minimum and still somehow manages to finish the race, you see the posts of people like didn't train for it but finished, whatever
I
race
got
is.
first
It's just like,
place.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You're always going to have those people on the periphery, right? But I think it's the exception, not the rule. And I do
Yeah.
think that at some point it's all going to come crashing down around them. And that it's not that I don't wish that upon anyone, but I do just personally
Right.
think that your body has an upper limit and they just haven't reached it yet. And they will at some point, and then they'll have to go back to the drawing board, wipe the slate clean, and try to figure out what the next iteration of their training looks like.
That makes sense, and I feel like for someone like that, it might be even harder to go back to the drawing board when
Yeah.
you've gone so far already.
Well,
Hmm.
as you're talking about that, how it's gonna come crashing down, I don't know if most ultra runners are familiar with David Goggins,
Yep.
and so I would probably consider as an outlier, well,
Yeah.
especially with how he got started.
Yeah.
Run 100 miles without any training. He was a fit
Yep.
guy though, but in his book he actually talks about how, and he was like placing third at races, like podium, and then all of a sudden he starts DNFing a lot of
Hmm.
races,
Hmm.
and he actually ended up being hospitalized, and none of the doctors could figure out what was wrong with him, and he
Yep.
ends up talking about he found mobility work, and that changed
Yep.
everything. He said no one will really believe me, but he's like, I literally felt like I was dying for some
Hmm.
reason, and
Hmm.
until I found mobility work, and all of a sudden life got brought back.
Yeah.
So
I think people discount it because, and I know this to be true because I've asked this question of a lot of the people in my Facebook group and just, clients that I work with. I think they discount it because we as runners or as athletes, we have this preconceived notion that if we don't break a sweat or it's not hard or we're not, there's not some sort of physical exhaustive effort, then it wasn't worth it. And I'm using air quotes, right? Like it wasn't worth it. It wasn't considered training. And that mentality, I think, is really what's holding a lot of people back from even just starting to do some sort of mobility because they're like, well, I'm not I might not break a sweat, so is it really
yeah,
worth it? And, I just refer you back to the last 30 minutes of this, like, podcast, like,
yeah.
it's totally worth it, the investment, and again, I have a lot of people too that will start this work begrudgingly, like, very begrudgingly, because they're like, no, I'm doing great. There's nothing wrong. Like, here's the other thing I get a lot. I don't have any aches and pains. I don't need to do mobility work. And that's
Mm.
also a sneaky, slippery slope because what you might not really see is that you might be quote unquote fine, but you have a smaller range of motion than what you could have, and you could feel better and you could get more out of your body, so to speak, if you were to just implement a few simple things here or there. I get that a lot. Like people that begrudgingly start, even though there's nothing wrong with them, and they'll come back to me 6 or 8 weeks later and be like, holy cow, this is amazing. I never knew that I could feel so good and run so much and not have hardly any issues, like little aches and pains and the normal sort of stuff that comes up. But people have come back to me and said, normally I hit X mileage per week or X mileage in my race, and X, Y, and Z starts to just break down. And that didn't happen. I feel so good. I can, I'm not incapacitated after my training runs or my races. Like, what kind of voodoo is this? you know?
Wow. So it's like we all have this untapped potential, and if we were to just
hmm
open this door to mobility, we could reach a whole new
So much
level.
stronger. Hold that
hmm
pace so much longer.
Yes. Yeah, totally.
So, all right, just a couple more questions before we let you go. This has been awesome.
I
I
know,
think,
I'm like, let's
yeah,
talk all night. Part 2?
I told you
really.
Another
I'm
hour?
down to geek out on mobility all day, every day. So,
So let's say I had some ankle issues. Go on. That's actually what I struggle with the most in my ankles.
Mhm.
And let's say it got me to the point where like I stopped running, but I went to a PT. I started doing ankle strengthening exercises. My ankle feels good, like I can manage walking and all. There's no more pain and all that. But obviously, I now want to get back to running ultras.
Mhm.
How and I know this is a loaded question and all this is very personal, but I guess in general, what would you suggest to that person as they're trying to get now you're because you talk about that gap,
Mhm.
from getting out of PT to then running ultras. Is it that I just continue those exercises the PT gave me as I start to run? Or what is like the next step for me to make sure that that ankle issue doesn't keep arising?
Mm. I would definitely say the part of the gap is keeping up with those PT exercises. And then there's probably a few, without seeing this ankle move, without, having too
Yeah.
much like physical eyes on this ankle to be able to say, okay, do this or do that. There's probably a few other auxiliary exercises that I would tack on to that core subset of things because, obviously the PT has seen you and knows like what's going on here. But ankles are also tricky. They're a tough structure because there's a lot going on there. There are lots of different bones, lots of different muscles wrapping around. So I also have I have ankle issues in the sense that I have like limited ankle dorsiflexion, which means pulling your toes up towards your shin, right? And so it makes it difficult for me to squat, deep like you see a lot of people doing. But so they're tricky and they take a lot of time to produce a result. So I'm right there with you in trying to work on my ankles as well. So a couple different exercises. And then the other thing I would say is don't just go right back to running. Start by doing lots of walking and just sort of
Mm.
test out that ankle, for a mile, 2 miles, start to stretch that out. Get to maybe like 3 miles worth of walking and then start to pepper in some running intervals and just start to, titrate it up, build up instead of just like we talked about before, lights off, lights on, go run 5 miles type of a thing, because that's really going to help you to test the waters with that ankle and see like, okay, is it really good to go for that running or should I just kind of hang out in the walking zone for a little bit, keep up with my PT exercises, and then pepper in those running intervals. I think that's probably the best way to start to go from graduating PT to building up to running. And that could take as little as 2 weeks. That could take as much as 6 weeks, just depending on the severity of the ankle issues and
Mhm.
how much time you have to devote to it and how diligent you are with those exercises. Like
Yeah,
that's a big
right.
part of it too.
Right,
But ankles are
right.
tricky. So you really gotta like, I think that's
Okay.
the thing too that people get frustrated with. It's like sometimes with running, you see results fairly quickly in terms of your cardio capacity and the distance and that sort of thing. With joint mobility, sometimes things happen pretty quickly with a few easy exercises and some low level repetition and inputs. Sometimes you have something like an ankle that's like tricky and there's a lot of complex movement in there and it's just going to take longer. And so going back to what we were talking about with mindset, like if you just have this mindset that like even if you think that this session that you're doing is complete shit, right? Even if you think that this session is total shit, like it's not going to do anything for you, you're still long term putting that penny in the bank and that's going to compound. And so if you can just have that overarching mentality like, okay, I don't think this is going to work, but I'm going to do it anyway because I'm adding to the bank. That's what's going to make the difference over the long haul.
I love that pink analogy, and I feel like something that might be helpful would be considering, like, I feel like this is worth $1 in the bank. I feel like this is worth a penny. I feel like this is worth $10 in the bank, and realizing kind of like what you've talked about in this podcast is where your priority is, what's the most important thing to hit.
Yeah. The tricky part with that is when you start to weight up different things, like if you go back to like you weight your runs as more important, then you get back to this idea that like
Oh,
Yeah.
I
the
see.
low level stuff isn't
You
as
can skip.
important. So I just make everything a penny
That
and
makes sense.
we're going for consistency and everything is, if you've determined that your plan consists of running, strength training, mobility, maybe you ride your bike as sort of like a cross training thing or you swim, like all those things are equal. Yes, in the back of your mind, you know that
Mhm.
like the running is a higher priority per se, but like when we go to the bank, when we put, everything is a penny because that's what's going to keep me consistent with everything across the board.
I like that. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that is great way to look at it because even through this training plan, that training cycle that I've been going through right now, I'm
Mm.
winding down on a training cycle. Like if I would have I missed a lot of my stretching sessions. I was good some weeks, but other weeks, when life got busy, I kind of saw like, oh, this 8 mile run is the needed thing today, not the strength workout or the stretching session. So I'm just gonna get that 8 mile run in. And you know what? That was the most important thing.
Yeah.
But if you just looked at it as everything's worth a penny, I'm like, no, rather I only got 1 penny today rather than 3. I didn't get my strength in, I didn't get my
Mhm.
stretching in,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so then it's like more of a like, oh geez, I didn't train very well today because I only got one of the 3 pennies.
That makes sense. Instead of like, oh,
Yeah,
my run was $10 and then these other 2
yeah,
things were 2 pennies. So it's
yeah,
okay that I missed out
yeah.
on 2
No,
pennies.
I think that
I see, I
I,
see.
I like that I like that you brought that up, Melody, and I like Megan's saying, yeah, I think that is an important mindset to
Yeah,
have.
And I
Okay.
think like everybody can relate to that too, Jacob, not to cut you off, but like everybody can relate to this idea of having a finite amount of time and, wanting to get to continue on with this analogy, like get the best bang for your buck in terms of training time. It's definitely the nature of the beast to try to prioritize things. And myself included, like I'll have days when I look at my plan and I'm like, and my calendar and I'm like, I have more on this calendar than I have hours in the day. So how am I going to, shuffle or how am I going to extend or cut short certain things to make time? And this is where if I go back to what we talked about earlier, like something's better than nothing. So even if it's just 5 minutes of the stretching when it was supposed to be 20, I still think that's worth a penny because you still made the conscious effort to show up and do it in some way, shape, or form. And that extends your streak, so to speak, on being consistent and showing up and doing the work. Because if it's an all or nothing mentality, you're far less likely to do it if you feel like you don't have time to do all of it. So I'm always encouraging people like, okay, you only have 5 minutes to stretch. You can get a lot done in 5 minutes and you'll leave feeling much better than if you don't do it at all.
for sure. I'm so glad that you brought that up because
Mhm.
you don't want to have the mindset of, oh, I only have time to stretch for 5 minutes, but I was supposed to stretch for 20 and I'm not going to give myself a penny for that. So I might as well not do it. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
get rid of
Yeah.
that all or nothing mindset. I love that.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
we should just get an actual penny
I was
jar
thinking
for
that. I was like, maybe we should. Why not?
and
It might actually be
and
helpful.
watch it fill up through your training
And it would
cycle.
just feel good, the
Yeah.
dopamine kick of putting all 3 pennies in.
Yeah, totally. I mean, anything that's going to help you do that, like, for some people, I don't know what you guys use to keep track of your training, but like I use Training Peaks. And so every time I like going in and seeing my calendar all green, right? So like if I
Yes.
go in there and I see red or orange or yellow, I'm like, damn it, no. And so like I'll, try to make my weeks mostly green so that I get that dopamine hit, right? And then so on and so forth. So that's how I like to do it. But I think your idea of actually getting a jar with pennies and putting it in there is a great idea.
Or maybe we could do candy and then
Oh
we get
no.
to eat it after our race.
It'd be too tempting to break into it beforehand.
We know
I
where your
know.
motivation
Yeah.
lies.
I'm not gonna pretend that that doesn't motivate me.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm with you.
Well, Megan, we're gonna start to wrap this up. This has been enlightening and just awesome to hear you share your knowledge with us.
So
So,
helpful. I want to throw this podcast out to the
all
world.
right,
Everyone needs
yeah,
to know.
yes, this has been awesome. And if we would have heard something like this when we first started ultra running, it would have changed the game
Yeah.
Yeah,
quicker
I
than
love
what it
that you
has.
guys are totally like down for helping people with their first 100 miler because I think that's a huge jump. And what got you, as you guys know, like what got you to 50K or 50 miles, that's a great foundation, but it's not going to take you to 100 miles.
Yeah,
And so you really have to go back to what we were talking about before, like take an inventory of not only your physical being, but like how's your scheduling, how's your mindset, how's your nutrition, like all of those things might need the next level of things. So I love that you guys are trying to, lay it out for people so that they can see, okay, you've got the foundations. Now you got to go the next level up and really dial up these different aspects of your training in order to get across the finish line happy, healthy, and in one piece, which is sort of
yeah,
like what I always tell people. Like that's
yes,
super important.
Because it's a big intimidating thing, right?
yeah,
But we're trying to show people that it's possible and it's not as big and scary and as intimidating as you think.
Hmm.
yeah. So, Megan, you yourself are a coach and you have a
Hmm.
podcast of your own.
Yep.
Uh, what got you into coaching and creating this podcast? Because you talk about helping people here with our mission.
Yeah.
Like, tell us about your mission and what you do as a coach and a podcaster.
Yeah. I started coaching because when I was trying to train for my first 50K, I didn't know any other ultra runners. I didn't know where to go to look for help. I literally Googled everything, like what does an ultra runner eat? Like what shoe? Like
Yeah.
I Googled everything. Like I have no shame in telling people. And so that process took me a lot of time. And what I wanted to do was help to shortcut that process for people and just sort of give them a resource. I mean, I looked for coaches, but I didn't know any of them. I felt like I didn't have a connection with any of them. This was back really like sort of before podcasting. It was a long time ago. So it was like you didn't have this opportunity to really get to know people on the internet without ever having met them face to face. And honestly, my first interaction with that coach that I hired back for my marathon sort of made me a little bit leery about hiring somebody else because I was like, are they going to give me 6 days a week again? And that really scared me. So I became a coach because I wanted to share everything that I had learned and I really wanted to help other women get into this sport because one of the things I noticed when I did start going to races was, hey, there's a lot of guys here. And there are some women, but there's not a lot of women. And
Yeah.
so I really just got onto this mission. My current mission is to try and help 10,000 women run their first 50K. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time and energy and attention and creating resources and information and stuff to help women get over that hump because I think that's the most challenging transition, right? It's sort of like someone today in my Facebook group commented about how like it's a slippery slope when you get into ultras and like I think that's a good thing, but getting from marathon to 50K can feel like a really big gap because you're like, how do I go from road running to trail running? And it's like a whole other ball game, so to speak. And so I feel like that transition can be made more seamless if you've got someone in your corner trying, like, sort of guiding you through the process. And so that's sort of what I focus on. Yeah, so that's my current mission.
That is awesome. Where can people find you for coaching? And then also tell us what your podcast is called.
Yeah, my podcast is called She Runs Ultras, and it's on Spotify, Apple. I hear tell that it's on Amazon. It's everywhere. It's basically everywhere you can find podcasts. And if you want to talk about coaching, you can follow me over on Instagram at Find Your Ultra. And if they want to get just more information about me, I mean, Instagram is the best place to go, but you can sort of go to my webpage, which is Meghan, Meghan dash Gould, Gould.com. I know I have things all over the place. I'm working to try to condense them to be all in the same place. But I'm mostly on Instagram and the podcast. Those are probably the best places for people to go to get information and sort of follow along. And I'm constantly documenting the process of my own training and sharing the stuff that I'm learning along the way. And it's super fun. I just love it. I don't know that I could do anything else. I definitely couldn't go back to working for anybody else. I think I'm committed to being my own boss now for forever.
Amen.
It's awesome.
Coaching is the best thing in the world.
Love
I
it.
think that.
Yeah.
So we'll put all of that in the show notes for anyone listening. You
Awesome.
can go down and link to any of that.
And you also have, like, you talked about that shakedown, the mobility shakedown, that you have a free link for that as well, don't you?
I do. Yeah, I'll send that to you guys as well, so you can give it out to people. Yeah, the video is like 15 or so minutes long, and you can just follow along. I have a lot of people that watch it a couple times and then they just memorize it and they do their own version, which is great. So it's meant to be a guide and a template to sort of help you explore different ways of moving. And then you can elongate it or shorten it based on the time and the location where you are, right? Like, I sometimes use it first thing when I wake up in the morning or as a pre-run warm up, or I'll even, like, right now after we finish this, I'm probably going to do one before I go to bed, because it's a great way to sort of like help you wind down, especially if you have a lot of energy. So it's a multi-purpose movement practice.
I love it. I'm
Great.
excited to watch
We're
it
gonna go check
and
it out.
implement it.
I know from this conversation, I'd highly recommend our listeners go check this out. So
Yeah,
For
we
sure.
all need a
Awesome.
little bit.
And last question, because our listeners might be curious, are you currently taking clients right now?
So right now I'm actually in the process of transitioning and building this online community, a place where women can go for the express purpose of getting coaching and community and resources around running specifically their first 50K. But then the community is actually going to be open to women at every level, because I think there's a lot of value in having sort of a mixed group, right? Women who've
For
never
sure.
done an ultra, to people who have done hundreds or even 200s in there. So we sort of like mix it up and everybody can share their stuff. So that's getting ready to go live within the next couple of weeks, depending on when this episode comes out. So by like mid to late June, that should be open. So if you listen to the podcast or you follow me on social media, that's going to be the best place for you guys to find that. And I'm super excited about that, because I've done a lot of one-on-one coaching. I've done a lot of groups, and I had to really think about how I was going to help, like, reach my goal of helping 10,000 women. And at the rate that I was going, that was going to take me like 20 years. And so I was like, how can we do this? Make it more fun, make it a bigger community, and like just connect more women who want to run these awesome races and like build out this community. And so this is the first iteration of it. I'm super excited. And yeah, so that'll be available mid to late June.
Cool. I'm excited. That sounds awesome.
Well, thank you, Meghan, so much for joining us here on the podcast today. We have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think we picked the right coach for our first pillar of ultra running
For
coaching
sure.
episode. So you start us off with a bang. Thank you
Yeah.
for coming.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to get on here and to talk about mobility and just geek out with people who get it, which is super fun. So thank you.
God.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I feel like this is so helpful, and like what you were saying, Jacob, I'm like, man, I wish that we would have heard this when
Mm.
we first started running.
Yeah. Yeah, this
Yeah,
is
that's how I
awesome.
feel about it too. Like just more, the more people that understand the benefits of varied training, right? Not just logging the miles. I think it's been so transformative for a lot of the people that literally that don't even coach with me. They just do the shakedown and they're like, how was I living my life before? I just have no idea. And I'm like, this is great. This is it. Like this is the whole goal. This is the whole mission,
Like,
right?
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
I started doing yoga. I haven't been great at mobility either. That's both of our biggest weakness, I think. I started doing yoga 15 minutes a day, just like yoga with Adriene on YouTube.
Yeah.
And now I literally can't go one day without it because I feel so good afterwards, physically and mentally. It's like such a good way to
Yeah.
like calm down, bring cortisol
Hmm.
levels down.
Hmm.
So
And that mental aspect too is like super, like everyone's so stressed out trying to figure out how to put all the pieces together, work and life and training and family and kid, like all the things. And it's just like, yes, your run is super important, but also your mental state is super important. So if you just carve out that little bit of time to, turn everything off and just move around and take some deep breaths and like, as woo woo as it sounds, like center your chi, right? Like just,
yeah.
get in. Yeah. It's like it does wonders for people. So yeah, I love it. I love that you're doing that.
Hey guys, it's Melody here. Thank you so much for listening to Trail. It means so much to us. I'm really excited to tell you about my coaching business where I help average Joes who are looking for a little bit more out of life do something big to find a little bit more purpose, direction, and meaning. Learn more on my Instagram at The Pine Tree Runner or on my website, melodybateman.biz. Links are in the show notes.